Alright, in this video I want to talk about Daniel's 70 weeks, but mostly about this gap here. Because see, a lot of prophecy teachers will focus on this first part, and then they'll focus on this part over here. But they don't really explain this gap, and why there's a gap, and where the scriptures explains this gap. So that's what I want to do in this video. I'm briefly going to talk about these two parts, but it's only to help explain this gap here. So let's go over here to Daniel chapter 9, and at verse 20 to 27 we read about, actually it's verse 24 to 27, we read about Daniel's 70 weeks. And there's a couple of key points to keep in mind here, is that the 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city. Right? So Gabriel's telling Daniel that the vision has to do with his people and his holy city. So it has to do with Israel, the Jews, in the holy city of Jerusalem. Right? So we have to understand that that's the foundation of the 70 weeks, that it has to do with the nation of Israel and Jerusalem. And it's also a few other things, but this is the main crux of it: his people and the holy city. It's to finish transgressions, make an end of sins, make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision, and to anoint the most holy. But we see here that that's all connected to Israel and Jerusalem. So, with that being said, let's focus down here at verse 27, where it already mentions that after 69 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. So when we come back to this, that's what we see go on here, right? Because Jesus was coming into Israel, or I should say Jerusalem, on Palm Sunday, and they were putting down the palm branches, welcoming him as King of the Jews. Yet the religious leadership of Israel rejected him, and the Messiah was cut off. So this last week was not actually fulfilled. You see, he was supposed to confirm the new covenant with them for 1 week, right? But he's cut off, and that's what we're going to actually study a bit here, where it says here in verse 27, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abomination he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So some people will take this to be he is the Messiah, confirming the covenant being the new covenant, and in the midst of the week he's cut off. So they think that after 69 weeks he starts confirming the covenant, and then after 3.5 years he is crucified. But when we actually dive into this, we can see that this is actually talking about the Antichrist. As we see here, the Messiah is the capital P prince, and then there's this lowercase prince, and the people are going to come and destroy the city and the sanctuary. This verse 27 is talking about that prince and the people coming to make that city desolate. As we go up here to verse 17, it actually talks about the sanctuary being desolate. So we can see that that's what is appeared to be talking about, and this picture will be painted a little bit better as I go through this, but there's a couple of key points I want to bring up before I start jumping around in Daniel and Revelation, and that is over here in Jeremiah chapter 30 verse 7, where it says, "Alas, for the day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it." So we see here again It's the time of Jacob's trouble, which is tying to this right here, because it's the 70 weeks determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, upon Israel, Jacob, right? It's a time of Jacob's trouble, not the church's trouble. It has to do with the nation of Israel. And this is right after it's talking about God causing Israel and Judah to return to the land, right? So when they turn into the land, there's going to be this time of Jacob's trouble. That's what this is referring to. And don't worry, I'll paint the picture. 1 Samuel chapter 11, at verse 2, it says, And Nahash the Ammonite answered them, On the condition will I make a covenant with you, that I may thrust out your right eye, and lay it for a reproach upon all Israel. And the elders of Jabesh said unto him, Give us 7 days respite. Okay. Why did I read that? Well, we see here, this is Saul, supposed to be the first king of Israel. But it's right before David becomes king, right? David is a representation of Jesus. So this is the actual setup of Israel trying to make a deal with the Antichrist. And it's right before Jesus actually comes back. And in order to make that covenant, there's a thrusting out of the right eye, and they ask for a 7 days respite. So this is like a 7-day peace treaty, or a 7-year covenant, as a day for a year, as we read about in Ezekiel. And that's exactly why we take this to be years. 70 weeks would be 490 days, but prophetically it's 490 years. So why do I say this is the Antichrist? Well, not to mention the 7-day covenant here, but the key here was the Ammonites and the right eyes. Because you see, when we talk about the false shepherd, and as we can see here, it has to do with the one betraying Jesus, a fellow Jew selling out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver here. The son of perdition, right? At verse 15 here in Zechariah chapter 11, it says, And the Lord said unto me, Take unto thee yet the instruments of a foolish shepherd. For lo, I will raise up a shepherd in the land. He shall not visit those that be cut off, neither shall he seek the young one, nor heal that is broken, nor feed that standeth still, but he shall eat the flesh of the fat, and tear their claws in pieces. Woe to the idle shepherd that leaveth the flock! The sword shall be upon his right arm, and upon his right eye. His arm shall be clean dried up, and his right eye shall be utterly darkened. This is the false shepherd, the Antichrist. The right eye here being darkened, and we see the connection here of making a covenant where he's like, I'm going to make you like myself and remove your right eyes. To be a reproach. Kind of like a mark that you're mine, right? So that's why you can start to see that this here is talking about the time of Jacob's trouble, talking about this 7-year peace treaty with an Antichrist. But let's just show it by what Daniel has to say as well. And in Daniel chapter 10, verse 14, it says, Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days. Now, this is right after Daniel gets this vision of the 70 weeks. And he's having trouble understanding it, right? So he's like, what the heck's going on? Well, that's when this angel comes and says, Hey, I'm going to actually fill you in on what's going on. So we know what's going to be talked about here has to do with this 70 weeks. Okay? And you notice that it says it's the latter days, so it's the end. And the time of Jesus was obviously not the end. Right? So let's come over here to Daniel chapter 11. And it's at verse 30, it talks about the ships of Shittim. Now, a lot of people say that is the Roman Empire because it has to do with the Phoenicians and is known as the lands of like Spain, Italy, France, and basically from Europe. So they make the connection that it's Europe, the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire that's broken up. So we get an idea of where this Antichrist is going to have its power, its kingdom. And at verse 31 it says, "An arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." So we see here about taking away the daily sacrifice and making the sanctuary desolate. That's what we have going on here, that he causes the sacrifice and oblation to cease and to make the city desolate. So right here, the angel's explaining, the angel explaining to Daniel that the Antichrist here, he's going to come and take away the daily sacrifice and set up the abomination of desolation. Right? It talks about through the covenant, he's going to corrupt with flatteries and do exploits, and that there's going to be people who understand among God's people, but they're going to, go through some tough times. And then when we come to verse 35, it says, "And some of them of understanding shall fall to try them and to purge them and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for an appointed time." So we see here this is the time of the end, because it's for an appointed time. So we see that again, this is going on at the very end of mankind's timeline. And that what is mankind's timeline? Well, you get that from Genesis, the week of creation. There were 6 days of creation, and then there was a Sabbath day, right? That's the timeline of man, where Peter tells us that a day with the Lord is 1,000 years, is as 1,000 years. So each one of those days would be 1,000 years. So that's 6,000 years. And then, like we read in Revelation, Jesus returns and there's 1,000 years of peace, a Sabbath rest. So we're about at the end of the 6,000 years from Adam and Eve fallen. And now we're getting ready for that 1,000-year Sabbath. That's the end. The end is we're coming to the reign of the Messiah. And we can see the connection again to verse 9:27 right here at verse 36. It says, "And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done." And we see this is the connection again to this, because this is what has to do with about what's determined shall be poured out. So we see the connection with the angel explaining again what is going on in this whole 70th week. Right? He's explaining this verse right here quite a bit in detail. Then verse 37 says, "Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all." I just wanted to show that in to really get the gist of who we're talking about and what's going on. And hopefully now you can grasp what's going on here, and that there is a cut. This is cut off to the end of time, because it's appointed for a certain time. And this, as it says here, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him." So again, the time of the end. Right? This is not something that happened during the time of Jesus walking the earth as a man. This is something that's in the future. Like as we see here, after 69 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. But we see that the 70 weeks has to do with the Messiah, right? So if the Messiah is cut off and the sanctuary is destroyed in 70 AD, we can see that as a cut-off point, and that the rest has to happen in the future, such as Jeremiah tells us that God's going to gather his people back. There's going to be a rebuilding of the temple, and that these things may happen, right? Because how can these things happen when they don't exist? You know, the people are scattered, the holy city is destroyed, there is no temple. How is the vision and the prophecy going to be fulfilled? It's because when Jesus was cut off here and gave up the ghost, he stopped the 70 weeks and he has given a grace period. And even the Jews have this, I guess you would call it tradition, where there's going to be a trumpet blast heard around the world, and they're going to know that the Messiah is coming, that there's some kind of warning. I don't know the details of it, but I was listening to it the other day, and I thought that was very interesting, what they were talking about. But to add to this, to show that this is a cutoff point, let's go to Daniel and Revelation to show this is talking about the end, that last week is cut off, because Revelation is basically talking about Daniel's 70th week. That's basically what it's getting into. And in Daniel chapter 12 it says, "And at that time shall Michael stand up." So at this time, that the time of the end, just to show you this is the end of the chapter, that these things are going on, which is Daniel's 70th week, that is when Michael stands up. That's exactly what we read in Revelation chapter 12. Where does it say Michael stands up for his people here? Right here, verse 7. "And Michael and his angels fought against the dragon," right? Because they're fighting for the woman. The woman is Israel, right? And as Daniel said right here, he stands up for the children of thy people. Who's Daniel's people? Israel, the Jews. Right here we have a woman clothed with the sun, standing on the moon, crowned with the 12 stars. The 12 stars represent the tribes of Israel, just like Joseph's dream in Genesis, where he had a dream of the stars bowing to him, right? That was his brothers and sisters, the 12 tribes. Well, I shouldn't say sisters in there, but his brothers bowing to him. Those are the 12 tribes. This is Israel giving birth to not only Jesus, but the body of Jesus, being the church. And this right here, verses 5 and 6, I'll highlight this here, is talking about two events that are very far apart. I don't know any other way to put that. You see where it says, "And she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron." Right? So before we go after this colon here, this is Israel bringing forth Jesus in the church. And then it says her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. This represents not only Jesus going up, but he's the head. The rest of the body, such as us, the feet, have not gone up, but we will. And that's when the woman flees into the wilderness, because you see there's a very long part that is cut off here, because Israel didn't flee into the wilderness for 3.5 years, right? 1,203 score days. That did not happen, right? This is a future event. such as what Jesus talks about in Matthew 24:25, where he says, hey, when this stuff goes on, get out of Dodge, right? Leave town. And that's where they go to the wilderness, and they're taken care of for 1,203 score days. And this is when Michael stands up. So when we read this, we can understand that this has to do with what Daniel's talking about, as he asks, like, when is this stuff going to take place and what have you? And he's told to shut up the words of the book and to seal it, because it's the time of the end. And that's exactly what John is explaining in Revelation. He's like, many shall run to and fro, knowledge shall increase. And then verses 7 and 9, I think he's saying something similar to that. So let me highlight it all so I know what I'm going to read here. It says here, verse 7, and I heard the man clothed in the linen which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and a half. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. And I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, go thy way, Daniel, for these words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Right? So, when we take this and compare it back over here to times, and a half a time, that's exactly what we read here. This 1,260 days is the same thing as right here, where it talks about she flees into the wilderness for a time, times, and a half a time. That's exactly what is being talked about here in Daniel chapter 12. Right? So I'm hoping you see that connection. You start to understand that all of this right here is connecting to this, which is explaining this last verse here, the 70th week of Daniel. So, with that being said, another point to connect this is right here. And it says, and the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And that's exactly what we actually read right here. And the end thereof shall be with a flood. Let's highlight all of that. And on to the end of the war, desolations are determined. So we see that connection again, connecting these two things together. Right? So I hope this was able to explain it, why there is a gap, and that the Bible actually tells you that there is a gap between the 69th week and the 70th week. I had the longest time and the toughest time trying to grasp that, but eventually God revealed it, and I hope I'm able to understand it well enough to explain it to you simply enough where you can now see it. I'm just going to pause and ramble for a minute because I want to just make sure that there's nothing else that I want to actually bring into this. And I don't think there is. I might just go over a quick summary, I guess, to wrap it up. So we have Daniel 70 weeks determined upon Israel, the Jews, and Jerusalem. When the Messiah is cut off, there's a grace period. When the Messiah is cut off, is connected to right here. The woman brings forth a man-child. And it's not until that man-child is taken up to the throne, the rapture, which I have explained in more detail in other videos, and how it's before the tribulation, that when that happens, it's just like what Jesus said to the Jews as a warning of when the things were going to happen, that there would be two people in bed, one would be taking one left, two people working in the mill, one taking one left, a couple people in the field, one taking one left. That's the rapture. That's the warning that this is going to happen. And like I said, the Jews have this uh, tradition that there's going to be a trumpet heard around the world, and that's the sign that, shit's going to hit the fan and the Messiah is going to show up. Well, that's going to be the rapture. The last trump, probably the Feast of Trumpets, looking like this year, which is probably what I'll end the video with, is explaining that. So that's what we see here, being cut off. And when the child is completely taken up to heaven, then the woman flees into the wilderness for 1,203 score days, or as it says down here, she's fleeing in for times and a half a time. That is talking about this last week here, at least the last end of this week, as Daniel talks about it being cut off, and at this time when Michael stands up, which is at the same time this is going on, Michael stands up and fights Satan and casts him out of heaven. While that is going on, we see that the times and a half times going on, Michael standing up for the people Israel, the Jews, Jerusalem, and that's who this woman is, who Michael's standing up for, right? And we know again that that's what is going on, because Daniel here in chapter 10 is trying to understand the 70 weeks that was explained to him, and it says that the vision is for the latter days, and he's going to be helped to understand it. And when he's told that he's going to be helped to understand it, he's told that it's for the time of the end, and that these people from this area, which you can study, are going to come, take away the sacrifices, set up the abomination of desolation, and all these other things, claiming to be God, Antichrist showing up. So we know that that is what is going on here, and we know that the covenant is not the new covenant, but actually some other covenant. As I brought up over here, we got the time of Jacob's trouble setting with Israel returning, the covenant doing with the Antichrist in the right eye for 7 days, the 7-year covenant here, as the Antichrist has his right eye darkened and his right arm withered. This probably has to do with, like a lot of people talking about, where the Antichrist shows up 3.5 years. He's actually following the peace with Israel, but then his right eye is withered. Well, his right arm is withered and his right eye is darkened, so that some kind of assassination attempt, probably. And he comes back, and that's where he's claiming to be God. And he breaks the treaty in the midst of the week, and that's why Israel is running off for that last 3.5 years into the wilderness, where the flood comes out, as mentioned here, but the earth swallows it up. And as you can see, it's the remnant of her seed. At the time of Jacob's trouble, Israel being the woman, her seed being Jews, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. That's why we read in Revelation 7 and 14, it has to do with the 144,000 Jews and a great multitude from the Gentiles, because it's no longer dealing with the church, because in the church there is no Jew or Gentile. But to wrap up this video, I would talk about these things here, these little time frames given here. It says it's for the time of the end. Now, I think there's a double application here. I think with most the scriptures, there's 3 applications. I think it has reference to do with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. I don't think these applications contradict one another. I think they flow together. I think it's just like using height, width, and depth to determine an object. the height doesn't contradict the depth, and the depth doesn't contradict the width of the object. They all come together to show you what the object is. The same thing with any type of three, like with light. The three base colors of light is red, yellow, and blue, right? They don't contradict one another. They're just three aspects of light, the base colors. So a lot of times when I listen to people and they have different views on things, I try to put them together to see if they fit together, because people might be seeing different things. Like some people might be seeing the height of the object while others are seeing the width, and others are seeing the depth of the object. So they don't understand the height because they're focused on the depth. They don't see the width because they're focused on the height. Or people with color, they're only seeing the blue, but they're not seeing the red. And then there's others who are just seeing the yellow. So you try to take it all and go, okay, well, maybe you're all seeing the same thing, and we need to put it together here. And that's what I think goes on here. I think there's two applications I see to this. If there's a third, I don't see it, but I just assume there's a third because of how God is. But anyway, I'll just read this real quick and then I'll explain it. It says here in verse 11 of Daniel 12, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waiteth, and cometh to the 1,335 days. But go thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest and stand in thy lot at the end of the days." So, if we take these times here and we actually apply them in two different ways, a day for a year, we come up with something interesting. Open up my calculator here real quick, because we have a actual date for the abomination of desolation, and we have a time for the daily sacrifices being taken away. And if we take the 1,290 days and add it to the time of the daily sacrifices being taken away, which was taken away around 600 BC. That's actually a few years before that. But if we take that time, we're just going to roughly, and we add the 1,290 days, we get to about 690 AD, right? I'm just going close. I'm not going to go on exact numbers here. That's when the abomination of desolation was set up. About 688 AD was when the Temple Mount was put up. Not the Temple Mount. The Dome of the Mosque was put on the Temple Mount. And that's where a lot of Jews were saying was the abomination of desolation set up. So when we go from the time the daily sacrifices are taken away and we go 1,290 days, that's where we go to. But as it says here in the next verse, blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,335 days. Now, if we actually add 1,335 days to the abomination of desolation, you want to guess what year that is? That's 2023. Very interesting stuff, because in 1948, Israel came back, born again in a day. And as Jesus said, when you see the fig tree come back and bring forth leaves, you know the time is near. That generation won't pass until they see all these things come to pass. A generation is 70 to 80 years. Israel will be 80 in 2028. So take that into consideration with what's being said here, that tribulation could be starting really quick. And if we take this time to add to the as a 7-year tribulation here, you could take this as the two halves of the 7 years tribulation. The tribulation starts. The 1,209 days would be the first half, while the Antichrist is being all nice to Israel. And then, boom, it's 1,335 days. And that's why Jesus talks about how there's people who think Jesus delays his coming. And they start to turn on everybody else. And they start to just do whatever because they think it was all bullshit. And that's probably because they don't really know God. God doesn't know them. They don't get into this and they don't study. They don't see that the second half is slightly longer. It's a couple months. I think it's 2.5 months or 3.5 months longer. So that would actually be discouraging to a lot of people. And instead of just being patient and talking to God like what's going on, they're going to just turn and be like, all right, well, it was all bullshit. I knew it. And then they're just going to go and live it up and start being dickheads, I guess. But that wraps this up. I use this as the thumbnail just to paint the picture for you, to show you what's actually going on. I was actually talking to somebody the other day about this 1,000-year reign of Jesus on earth, and they were thinking, no, we're all taken to heaven at the end of the tribulation and we're going to rule in heaven. And then we come back here. And I was like, well, explain this to me. Explain to me why the Jews at the time of Jesus over here thought that the Messiah was coming to reign as king in Jerusalem and reign over the world. Why did they believe that? Because that's what the prophecies said about Jesus, the Messiah. There's two parts of what the Messiah was going to do. He was going to die for sins, but he was also going to reign as king, and that's what they thought he was going to do. But he wasn't doing that, so they got upset, and they rejected him as Messiah. He's going to reign here at the millennium, at the 1,000-year Sabbath. All right? So he's going to be reigning on earth. That's why we got all these prophecies about the nations coming to Jerusalem to worship God during the feast days. Not only that, when Jesus comes back, he's going to be slaying people at the Mount of Olives with the sword of his mouth, and he's going to tread the winepress of the wrath of God. Now, if he comes back here, there's nobody here for him to do that to. So I was asking him to explain that, and they couldn't explain that. So it was just easy to dismiss what they were saying because they had no reason to believe what they were believing. They just were believing it apparently because they were told to believe it. But yeah, that will wrap up the video. I hope you were able to explain now that there's a gap, why there's a gap, and that the Bible teaches that there's a gap between the 69th and the 70th week. Thanks for watching, and take care.